All right, y'all, this week we're back. 3 more questions. I feel that it's only proper on this solemnity of the Immaculate Conception to answer this question. How was Mary, a human without sin, able to be conceived from St. Anne, a person with sin? Good question. So I believe this question is getting at whether or not the sin, the original sin that St. Anne would have passed on to Mary, based on the fact that Mary was conceived through normal human means, and does that pass on? Well, according to the teaching of the Immaculate Conception, time works a little bit different for God. So God can apply time however he deems and feels fit. And so we believe that the salvation that came from the cross, the salvation from that sin, would have been preemptively applied to Mary when she was conceived. So Mary, even though St. Anne would have been someone who was sinful, would have been conceived without sin because God applied that, right? So it was a grace that was given to her, in a sense, early. We receive that grace at our baptism as infants, and it's almost as if Mary just received it at conception as opposed to that baptism. So even though Anne was with sin, she conceived Mary, who was without sin, because of the works of God. I got one more Mary question, but before that, how do you break a bad habit? Again, good questions here, y'all. Number 1, I would say ask for help. Whether that's actually a human person who can help you, or more importantly, ask for help from the Lord, because the Lord can ultimately be the one who helps you. We sort of have to begin by humbling ourselves and recognizing that we are in need of help. So start there, because ultimately we hear from Philippians chapter 4, verse 13, that we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. So humble yourself, go to him first. Second, I would say make a plan. So you got to humble yourself, and you got to have a game plan. You don't want to go in blind. If you see that you keep falling to this same habit over and over and over again, if you just continue doing the same thing, you're probably going to continue to fall. So come up with a plan, figure out exactly where you typically fall, what the circumstances typically are. It's like a playbook for a football game, right? You're not going to go in without any idea what you're going to do. No, you're going to look at the opponent. You're going to look at that habit that you continue falling to, and what are the circumstances around it? Is it a typical time? Is it a typical way that you feel? Are you like falling to this habit when you're stressed out, when you're tired, when you're hungry, when you're angry? What are those things that typically occur before you fall to it? So recognize those and come up with an actual plan to fight against them. And lastly, learn from mistakes. The most likely situation is that if this is a habit that is built up, you will fall again. That's okay. Ultimately, the thing about falling is that it's okay because we know that we can get back up. So if you have a mistake and you fall again, learn from it. Figure out exactly, again, where you fell, what went wrong, and strategize for it. If you need to get to the sacrament of confession, get there. Those graces that the Lord gives us through that sacrament are going to help, because they ultimately aid us in fighting those bad habits. And lastly, did Mary go through pain while giving birth? And it says in parentheses, since she was sinless. So there's 2 places that we have some evidence here, scripture and the teachings of the church. Let's look at them. I'm going to actually read the scripture from Isaiah chapter 62. This is a prophecy of Mary. It can't really apply to anyone else. And it reads as follows. Listen, an uproar from the city, a voice from the temple, the voice of the Lord, rendering recompense to his enemies. Before she was in labor, she gave birth. Before her pain came upon her, she was delivered of a son. Who has heard such a thing? Who has seen such a thing? Isaiah gives us this prophecy of a woman who gives birth, and before she even feels the pains of birth, she has the child. So like I said, this prophecy can't really apply to anyone else. We would have to understand that it applies to Mary. So there's one instance from the Old Testament. From the New Testament as well, Luke chapter 2, verse 7, and she brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger. So we hear that she brought forth the son, but also we know when giving birth, typically the mother is not necessarily able, because of the pain, to wrap the child and take care of them and place them in the manger. That's something that's fairly difficult to do with those pains of childbirth. Even in the first century, there probably would have been a midwife or Joseph there to help, but we hear that Mary did it. It's, in a sense, a clue that she would not have experienced those pains during the birth. So those would be scriptural references towards a painless childbirth for Mary. There's also reference from the Catechism of Trent, and it reads as follows: "Just as the rays of the sun penetrate without breaking or injuring in the least the solid substance of glass, so after a like but more exalted manner did Jesus Christ come forth from his mother's womb without injury to her maternal virginity. From Eve we are born children of wrath, from Mary we have received Jesus Christ. To Eve it was said, in sorrow shalt thou bring forth children. Mary was exempt from this law, for preserving her virginal integrity inviolate, she brought forth Jesus without experiencing, as we've said, any sense of pain." So Eve was subject to that pain due to the sin, since Mary was without sin. She's the new Eve, a member of the new covenant. She wouldn't have been affected by those laws of the old covenant. So based on that evidence from scripture and from the teaching of the magisterium, the church, we would have that belief that Mary would have been free from the pains of childbirth. So on this Solemnity of the Immaculate Conception, 2 questions about Mary, 1 question about breaking some bad habits. Great questions, y'all. We've got a couple more to get through over the Christmas break. We're going to take our time with those because we have a little bit of time. But yeah, thanks for asking your questions.